You see, the message of the original Star Wars trilogy is that virtue triumphs over evil. Meanwhile, the Disney trilogy is much more based on our modern, more narcissistic culture. It's all about individuals being comfortable with their identities. Hello everyone. Now, during the past couple of weeks, this channel has focused on some pretty heavy-handed issues. I've released videos on pornography addiction, communist district attorneys, and vulture capitalism. For those of you who watch this channel, I think you're overdue for some more lighthearted subject matter. So I thought I'd give you my thoughts on the Disney Star Wars trilogy. I think that overall, the Disney Star Wars trilogy was a failure. It appeared that Disney was trying to make a Star Wars trilogy that would live up to the original. I also think that it's really hard to compare the Disney trilogy to the prequel trilogy. They seem to have different sort of objectives. The prequel trilogy to me really seemed like a cash grab by George Lucas. George Lucas wrote and directed those movies. He really didn't seem very interested in the quality of the movies. He was aimed at making movies that would appeal to children and that would sell lots of merchandise, lots of video games and toys and things like that. To answer the question of whether the prequel movies were a success or failure really depends on how much money George Lucas made through all of his merchandising rights. Disney bought the rights to Star Wars from George Lucas for $4 billion. To Disney, this was an investment. And Disney needed to release a Star Wars trilogy to establish the fact that the Star Wars franchise was still good, that they could still make good movies using this intellectual property. That's why Disney brought in J.J. Abrams to help direct The Force Awakens. It's why they gave him a massive budget. They really wanted to make sure that they got this right. So why is the new Star Wars so bad compared to the original trilogy? I think a lot of it has to do with how American culture has changed since the time the original trilogy was released and how American culture functions today. The plot of the original Star Wars trilogy wasn't very interesting. It's basically a story about good versus evil. In any story where a good person battles against an evil person is generally going to be a pretty boring story. Stories that are interesting tend to have things like drama and nuance to them. So with such a boring premise, why was the Star Wars trilogy any good to begin with? From a story perspective, the Star Wars original trilogy heavily relied on archetypal characters. You had the hero, Luke Skywalker, the damsel in distress, Princess Leia. You had the rogue, Han Solo. You had the wise old man, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then later Yoda. And of course, the antagonist, Darth Vader. In addition to using archetypal characters that people found easy to relate to, the characters were given dramatic flourishes, flaws or problems the characters had to deal with that they overcome throughout the length of the trilogy. Luke Skywalker is cocky and overeager. He eventually overcomes this in Return of the Jedi when he becomes a wise and disciplined Jedi Master. Han Solo is selfish, something that works to his disadvantage, but he eventually is able to overcome. Princess Leia gets saddled with the responsibility of leading a rebel army after her family and entire planet is destroyed by the Empire. Even Darth Vader is given a dramatic flourish that makes his character more interesting, and the Empire Strikes Back, when he reveals that he's Luke Skywalker's father, and proposes an alternative way that Luke could join forces with him to try and confront the Emperor. It is this use of archetypal characters with dramatic flourishes that I believe made the original Star Wars story work. Now, there were other more technical factors as well. The movies were exceptionally well edited for the time period they were made in. I think the space battles and the science fiction setting was pretty novel for the time and pretty interesting. It stood out from other types of movies. And of course, very important was the excellent soundtrack by John Williams. Now let's contrast this with the Disney trilogy. First of all, the Disney trilogy doesn't use archetypal characters. Social justice warriors don't tend to be big fans of archetypal characters, because archetypes are at least partially influenced through traditional gender norms. In the Disney trilogy, a few of the characters are given dramatic flourishes through character flaws, but these really have nothing to do with their character arcs. For example, the character Finn in The Force Awakens, and also later on in The Last Jedi, takes actions that reflect cowardice. It appears that Finn has a character trait that he acts like a coward when he's confronted with dangerous situations. Poe Dameron is also suggested to perhaps have some sort of character flaw in The Last Jedi, when he challenges authority. However, this was a very weird character flaw. The way the scenes are portrayed in the movie inclines the audience to be in agreement with Poe Dameron, that his actions were justified given the circumstances of what was going on. It's hard to convince the audience that a character has some sort of character flaw when the audience believes the character is doing the right thing. Regardless, neither of these flaws prove to be at all important in their character arcs. Finn never has a breakthrough where he overcomes his cowardice. And what happened in The Last Jedi doesn't seem to have any effect on Poe Dameron's character at all. It's also very significant that the main character, Rey, doesn't seem to have any dramatic flourish or character flaw at all. In every situation where Rey is confronted with some sort of obstacle, she easily overcomes it. Now, some people might conclude that this means that the characters don't have arcs at all, but I disagree. They have a very different type of arc. And this is what I'm referring to when I said that what sets this trilogy apart is how informed it is by modern American culture versus how the original trilogy was informed by American culture in the 1970s. The character arcs in the Disney trilogy are all about characters becoming comfortable with their identities. Rey's character arc is all about learning about her lineage and making peace with it. This is also the same character arc that Finn and Poe Dameron go through. In the latest Star Wars movie, Finn becomes comfortable with his identity as a former stormtrooper through interactions he has with other individuals who were also former stormtroopers. Likewise, in the beginning part of the newest Star Wars movie, it's alluded to the fact that Poe Dameron has a lot of talents and abilities that likely would have been learned through a life of crime. And of course, later on in the movie, Poe Dameron encounters someone who he knew from his past life as a criminal, and he ends up making peace with his identity. The character arcs in the new Disney Star Wars movie are all about personal identities. The central issue is, who am I, and am I comfortable with who I am? This is very much the opposite of the original Star Wars trilogy. Han Solo did not come to terms with the fact that he was a scoundrel and embrace it. Luke Skywalker did not come to terms with the fact that he was undisciplined and cocky. He overcame it. You see, the message of the original Star Wars trilogy is that virtue triumphs over evil. In order to overcome adversity, characters need to cast aside their flaws. They need to be better versions of themselves in order to deal with the problems that they face. This can even mean sacrificing yourself, like when Darth Vader saves Luke Skywalker from the Emperor. Darth Vader's character arc was discovering that what he was doing was wrong. The story in the original trilogy of Star Wars is informed by an older cultural tradition, one that focused less on individual identities and more on people living virtuous lives. Meanwhile, the Disney trilogy is much more based on our modern, more narcissistic culture. It's all about individuals being comfortable with their identities. So you may be asking yourself, well, just because the character arcs are different, why is it that the ones in the original Star Wars movie work while the ones in the most recent Disney Star Wars trilogy don't work? That's a good question. I think the reason for that is our concept of virtue is based off of our moral intuitions, which we gained through evolution. I don't want to get too off tangent here, but I would cite to Jonathan Haidt's work on moral psychology. Given that human beings always lived in groups, and their groups often competed against other groups of rival human beings, we evolved certain moral intuitions that allowed our groups to outcompete other groups. So when we watch a movie and we see a character act arrogant, or steal or lie, our moral intuitions don't like it. And when something bad happens to that character, when they get their comeuppance, we tend to enjoy that. This is a reason, for example, that in a lot of horror and slasher movies, before characters are killed, they usually do something that is morally questionable. So when we watch the original Star Wars trilogy and we see characters overcome their character flaws and end up overcoming adversity as a result of it, it plays to our moral intuitions. It accords with the morality that we've evolved over time, one that respects people who are brave, wise, and disciplined, and despises people who are reckless, cowardly, or cheating. The character arcs in the Disney Star Wars trilogy don't play to our moral intuitions at all. It's all about individual identity. I imagine that most people watching these movies don't really care about how Rey feels about her identity. We don't really care that Finn is comfortable with the fact that he was a former stormtrooper. These character arcs just aren't going to be very appealing or interesting to most of the audience. I think that it's telling that the third movie is the worst reviewed out of the three, given that it's the movie that contains the bulk of these character arcs. Now let's combine this with the other three things that I said made the original trilogy great: the editing, the setting, and the soundtrack. I think that the editing of The Force Awakens was fine. I liked that J.J. Abrams went away from what George Lucas was doing in the prequels. In the prequels, every fight was incomprehensible and ridiculous. Characters did all of this acrobatic nonsense. The lightsaber was used constantly. It was confusing to tell what was going on. Everything was CGI. J.J. Abrams did a good job in The Force Awakens of making all of the action scenes pretty dramatic. For example, when Finn has the lightsaber fight with the stormtrooper's calling him a traitor. When he swings at him, it seems like it has a lot of gravity and weight to it. It's not a bunch of characters doing backflips and dance moves. The same thing was true when Rey fought Kylo Ren for the first time. It was dramatic and tense. In The Last Jedi, the quality of the editing declined quite a bit. You had a lot of scenes that were just completely pointless to the movie, like when they go to the gambling planet. That movie was way too long, and majority of the scenes in it were entirely pointless. They didn't advance the story at all. The editing of this most recent Star Wars movie is just a complete mess. It's gone back to prequel territory, where it's confusing to tell what's happening. The final space battle above the Sith planet is just completely incomprehensible. It's like I'm watching a Transformers movie. The movie feels incredibly disjointed and scenes just seem entirely pointless. Like when they encounter the snake monster in the tunnels. It's completely pointless. What about the setting? Well, I mean, it's still Star Wars. The setting hasn't really changed. I guess it's not quite as novel as it was when the original trilogy just came out. And finally, the soundtrack, they brought back John Williams, but the quality is nowhere near as good as the original trilogy. And I think the soundtrack was really important as to why those original movies were good. Without that John Williams soundtrack, I'm not sure they would have been nearly as successful as they were. Anyways, that's my thought on the Disney Star Wars trilogy. I know this was kind of off topic. It'll be interesting to see if this video does well, or if I should just stick to primarily political videos. But anyways, if you happen to stumble upon this and you're not a subscriber to my YouTube channel and you like the video, please subscribe.